guys. Welcome to another episode of Soul Things Podcast. I'm your host, Brenna, and a licensed professional therapist where I sit down with other experts in the field to talk about some of the struggles we go through in our 20s. So I am so excited to get into our topic today, second episode of season 5 with my good friend, Katia.
Hi, Brenna.
Welcome
Thanks
to the podcast.
Me.
So Katia and I went to grad school together, and so she's also a licensed professional therapist, and she is here to crush it on today's topic.
These are big shoes to fill, Brenna.
So I've been doing this with every single one of my guests this season, and regardless of their age, and we just talk about like, what is your current struggle? Because so much of what we talk about with Soul Things and the Soul Things community is the hard spaces. So for you, what is your current hard space, and like, what are you learning from it?
Yeah, I think for me, especially since transitioning out of grad school into work, I've really sort of been struggling with like how to make friends again as an adult, and like just like the process of getting to know people in a much more like organic way than being in like a program with people. That's probably been one of my biggest struggles.
Yeah, because like our grad school experience was a little bit different than some other people's, where we were like cohort based. So we had every single class together. We were forced to spend time together, forced to be traumatized together.
Yeah, literally.
And so now that we don't have any more trauma bonding, how do we make connections? How do we function in this world? So I feel you on that. And it actually ties in nicely to our topic today, which is a universal experience, and it's the struggle of loneliness. So I feel really passionate about this topic because it is something that I do struggle with, and I think a lot of people in our generation do, more so than ever before. I don't think some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about is super like, you know, surprising or shocking. I really do think this is like a universal experience, and I think I just kind of want to start off talking about loneliness, about like defining what exactly it is for people and talking about our experience a little bit. So like, what is loneliness?
Yeah, I like looked this up actually on the internet. Google. And found some, like they all were kind of the same a little bit. And basically the gist of a lot of what I found was like a lack of friends, a lack of close connection, which I think is definitely true. But there's always like that sort of hard space where it's like people can be lonely and be surrounded by like tons of quote unquote friends, and yet they still feel super lonely. So I was like, well, I don't know if I 100% agree with that. So I think if I were to define loneliness, I think that I would define it as like a deep sense of longing, really, a deep sense of yearning for connection and really to be known. And we both had a professor in grad school that talked about how like people desperately want to be known, but yet are so afraid to be known. And it's like that war between those two that keeps us stuck a lot of the time.
Yeah, I feel like loneliness is really a state of mind rather than like what's going on in your external like world. Like you said, being in a room filled with people and still having this like jarring sense of like separateness from everybody. Like that almost feels like worse to me than like actually like physically being alone and alone. It's like, what is wrong with me? Like, why can't I connect with people, or why don't I feel connected? Like for me, it can be a very like scary, confusing feeling. And I imagine for a lot of people, it's like, well, like this just feels like too much. So I'm going to go doom scrolling, or I'm going to go find connection somewhere that's probably not healthy. So tying it into our last episode about curiosity, I decided to be curious about loneliness because it's also one of the, as some of you guys who are listening already know, I did a bunch of research before I started this season. And one of the most common struggles was loneliness that everybody filled out on the survey. And so I think a lot of people are like, yeah, like there's a lot going on in life right now, but really I'm just like lonely.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to get into something about chronic loneliness that I found out about, which I found like really, really interesting. It's like when you go through long periods of like feeling lonely, like it actually starts to like do stuff to you and like do stuff to your brain and do stuff to your body. So I'm going to actually like hop around a little bit, but thinking about like from a therapeutic standpoint too, it's like when you're sitting with clients that are lonely and stuff, it's like there are things going on like a neurobiological level that we need to like address. And so like, I'm curious, like for you, like what have you found that's been going on in like the brain and body during loneliness?
Yeah. I was looking into some research about this, and I found some really interesting research by a man named Dr. John Cacioppo. And he's like one of the most probably relevant researchers right now in the field of like neuroscience of the brain and how it connects to loneliness. And he found some really interesting things. And he was talking about how even though we live in like the most connected society ever, we also like we've never been lonelier. And so it's like, what about that? Why is it like that? Our brains are really good at perceiving functionality and not reality.
Yeah.
Which is something that I
That's
find.
well said.
Yeah. I find that to be true when I'm sitting with clients, because like say I have a client who's really struggling with loneliness, like everything is sort of seen in this lens of like negativity and isolation. And there's like very little gray space. It's either like I'm connected or everyone hates me. And there's no in between. And so Dr. John Cacioppo was talking about how if we start to think about loneliness sort of in the sense of like it's a pain receptor in the body, that it can totally change the way people see it, because you know, people born without pain receptors live like really dangerous lives because they can't like tell what's going on with them. And so like when we start to feel a sense of loneliness and we are able to be gentle enough with ourselves to see that, hey, this is just indication that I'm lacking something that I genuinely need, that can be a lot better place for us to sort of launch.
Yeah, I love it. I have so many questions that come to my head as I think about that research, because I came across him as well.
Okay.
Like, yeah, you did a really good job of summarizing like some of his major work. And I think I am so interested. There was like a comparison of like our autoimmune system of like, even though there's nothing like going wrong, like our immune system's like attacking itself. And I think sometimes what can happen is like the whole negativity bias, like you said, like it ties into the chronic like loneliness piece, is like when we're lonely, we can start building habits and patterns that are fueled by our brain going haywire and essentially attacking itself. Like if we think about like our amygdala and our fear systems, like as a therapist, we kind of live in the amygdala in a lot of spaces with clients, because that's where a lot of the trauma responses come from.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the amygdala just starts attacking you a little bit, and you start seeing like social interactions differently and like people differently the longer that you're kind of feeding some of this loneliness. And it's like when I was reading about that, I was like, oh my gosh, like this feels a lot more dangerous than I realized. Like it's not like, oh, I'm just going through a loneliness season. It's like, no, if like something doesn't change or we're not able to like get out of this, like our brain can like feed into seeing like people's facial expressions differently, or like texting is like a big thing that feeds that. I don't know if you resonate with that part. It's like, okay, well,
they didn't put an exclamation point.
Like no one's texting me today. Like they haven't responded in 3 hours, and it starts to feed that trauma or that pain receptor that you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because like from the second we're born, like babies are wired for connection. And I don't 100% like have the stats on this, but there was that really famous like research study done in a Romanian orphanage, I think, where it's like the infants were being like clothed and fed, and like they were in a safe environment, but yet they were still like failing to thrive. And so then people started wondering like, why are babies dying right now? And it's because I believe like we're divinely like designed for connection from the moment we're born. And I think that people like kind of forget that as they get older, because they're like, oh, well, you know, like it's just part of growing up, you know, people grow apart, like people get busy, but like we're still divinely designed for connection. And so it's like, it's a very human response to feeling alone.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be viewed as like a characterological flaw
Yeah.
if we're feeling lonely. It's not like a moral issue.
Yes.
It's just part of our wiring.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of brings me to like the prevalence of loneliness now. Like, I was shook at one of the first things I found out is that the U.S. Surgeon General literally was like, yeah, we're in a loneliness epidemic. There's a huge advisory out for it. So here's like a 100-page document to look at to figure out how do we solve this problem, because it actually has implications on our health. It's like the equivalent of smoking like 15 cigarettes, right? And
I saw that.
I was like, what? That sounds dramatic. Like when I first read that, and then when you said pain receptor, I was like, oh, okay. This is making sense. Like our brain is sending us a signal to protect us because we weren't actually meant to feel alone and to be alone. And that's different than having your alone time and solitude. Like that's always important. Yeah. We're talking about this like bigger concept here of it. But yeah, like why is it so prevalent, Katia? Like why do you feel like so many clients are coming in and so many friends in our lives are just like struggling with this problem?
Yeah. I think a big portion of that has to do with the fact that when people are lonely, it's really hard to take the risk of being vulnerable with people.
Yeah.
And it really is a risk. And I think a lot of the times when people are already in a space of not feeling 100% or not feeling like socially confident at all, the idea of like taking a step towards somebody in that time is like super scary. And I think a lot of times, myself included at times, I've been like, oh, I'm not taking the first step. Someone's going to have to prove to me that they want to get to know me. And I'm not going to take that risk. And then I stay stuck there, disconnected. And I'm like, what the heck? Why isn't anyone taking a step towards me?
Yeah, that's so true. My mind went straight to social media.
That does have something to do with it, I'm sure.
Because my mind was thinking about like other eras of history or even other generations. Like recently, it's like, it's not that other people I'm sure haven't struggled with loneliness, but it just seems like the fact that it's like an actual like epidemic right now is kind of like, where can I point the finger? Like what's going on? Because it's feeding into our pain receptors in a way that's very like unhealthy. And sometimes I mean, we talk about this on the podcast and people know how I feel about social media in a lot of ways. And it's not condemning anyone that uses it. It's just like, I think the facts kind of speak for themselves in a lot of ways. Like, is this doing more harm to us than good, of like people taking advantage of like our deepest longings in life, like you've been talking about? It's like we all want to be known, we all want to be loved, and this provides us a false sense, I think, of feeling some of those things.
Yeah, and people only put the highlights on social media for the most part, so it's not super conducive to vulnerability, honestly. Like no one's gonna, well, some people would, but most of the time our first instinct is not to post on Instagram or Facebook about how we're feeling lonely and we need connection. It's more about like, oh, look at all these people that I'm hanging out with, but none of them actually know me. So
that one, like I felt that one in my chest when you said that, because I think too in our young 20s it's all about like quantity. Like we want to, like college, like we want to have the most friends, we want to have, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, I don't know, but like you want to have like a feeling of belonging in a group. And I think you're right. Like it's about the quality of connection.
100%.
And so much of online presence is a low quality of connection, in my opinion, because it's like it's a comment here, it's a comment there. And that's like nice, but it's not really doing anything for our like actual social need as a race of people, right? It's like, or a species of people. It's like, I think I just struggle, like even sometimes with like texting and stuff. I think the most recent thing for me and my quality of connection has been like, well, I'm like super busy. Other people are super busy. So it's easy to send a text here, send a text there. And like, that's why I'm like staying connected. And to some extent you are, but I think it's been kind of feeding this sense of like loneliness and isolation of like, no, I need to like make time to like sit with people face to face. Even like FaceTime is a little bit better for me because I'll like see people, but it's like, I think what I try to talk to with clients about, and even to myself, is like, you need quality connection, right? Just like with food, it's like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat all these cheeseburgers and stuff. I'm like, okay, well, like, you need quality nutrients, you need quality things that are gonna fill that need up. That is like biological inside of you.
Yeah, for sure. Quality over quantity, right? Which people say sort of as like in a slightly quippy way, but it's 100% true.
Yeah. How do you feel like you find quality connection?
I think part of it has to do, again, sort of how I said before. In some ways, it's like the way I can tell sometimes if someone that I'm interacting with like seems to be a quality connection is whether or not they're reciprocal in my step towards them. And if they are, then that's kind of like the green light for me of like, okay, like maybe we can build this relationship further than just like sitting next to each other in class or, you know, a coworker at work. So that's kind of how I personally I kind of test the waters. I throw it out there a little bit sometimes, and then if it's reciprocated, I'll usually try to pursue that friendship a bit more.
It makes me think of like Brene Brown stuff of like vulnerability breeds vulnerability stuff. Like I think she talks a lot, like a lot of her work connects to what we're talking about today. Is you do kind of have to take this risk. I remember being in my young 20s telling people I just have to force my friendship upon people.
Right.
Like I just like was resolved. Like, you know, when you're younger and you feel so like nothing can hurt me. I can do it. Like you're so like invincible. Like, and then the life just punches you in the face a little bit. And you have some pretty I had some pretty difficult friendship experiences, and you know, you're growing so much in this decade too. Like even the person you're becoming, it makes it confusing trying to navigate friendships of like, okay, like I used to feel connection with this person and now I'm like, who are you? You know? And I think, I don't know if you resonate with that with grad school too. It was a lot of like, I am learning so much about how people work, how I work. I need to work through my stuff. And to some extent, it did like change some of my relationships a little bit. Do you resonate with that at all?
Yeah, I totally do, for sure. And I think like tying on, sort of going into that a little bit is like, I think some of the time we want to just assume that, okay, vulnerability breeds vulnerability, but it's only once. When no, it's like a continual process throughout the relationship with that person. And I know for me, it's been a struggle, and it was a struggle for me in grad school to be like, okay, I put myself out there, but I have to continue to put myself out there. And when other people put themselves out to me, like to receive them well and in the way that they need. So it's not just a one and done situation, unfortunately. Sometimes.
Dang it.
I know. It's the worst.
I feel like I always tell clients that I'm like, I wish I had an easier answer for you, or I wish it wasn't this way, but it is. And I really love that you bring up that point too of how are we, like I think chronic loneliness especially makes us so hypervigilant of how other people are perceiving us that we forget how are we receiving other people. And the more I looked into this and the more I realized this is a universal thing, this is an epidemic, you're not the only one, it felt kind of comforting a little bit. Not that I want other people to be lonely, but I was like, oh, okay. Like, that's like, okay. Like, I know if I'm feeling like this, maybe Katia's feeling like this. Let me reach out to her. Right. So I think it can also be an adaptive response opportunity to be like, oh, this signal's going off in my brain. I feel this. So what do I need? I need some connection. So what helps me feel connected? And then like kind of using it as just like a signal instead of like, oh my gosh, I'm lonely. I'm good. Like, and just start spiraling, which can happen in a lot of my life for sure. But yeah, do you have any other like insights into like why you think this is such like a prevalent thing for our generation?
Some of the research that Dr. Casiopo was presenting was that loneliness sort of leads into more self-centeredness. And I was like, I don't like the way that sounds, but I think he's right. Unfortunately, like it can lead to depressive symptoms. It can lead to more like just negative views of people. And so when you're already in that headspace, it like inadvertently and like probably subconsciously you do push people away.
Yep.
And so then it continues this cycle of isolation, which further compounds the issue. So we're back at square one. And so that's where therapy can be really helpful, is sort of taking a look at those patterns and from a more objective standpoint.
Yeah. And I also, I want to, like, for people listening, I want to validate that fear of rejection that Katia was talking about earlier, because that can feel really paralyzing.
100%.
Like, I know people like listening to this probably feel lonely right now for various reasons in their life and are struggling to even have the motivation to want to get out of it, right? Because especially if it's been chronic for a long time for you, of just like something that I feel like has been so helpful for me in this journey of struggling through loneliness, because I think that it's not like I've overcome it, now listen to us talk about it. Like, that's not really what this is. It's I'm in it with you guys, and Katia's in it with you guys, and we're just like trying to make sense of all of this, because I think we are meaning-making creatures, right? I think that another professor told us about that one time. It's like we're always searching for meaning of like, what is this, which breeds curiosity. So it's like, what is this loneliness? Like, okay, what's going on here? And like start being curious about your own loneliness instead of like judgmental towards it, of like, oh, like I would find myself beating myself up of like, oh, I just keep thinking about myself. Like, I just need to go like go serve or go do something. And which is like, you see the heart behind that, but it's also like maybe the posture's a little off. Like, how do we have a little softer positioning? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And especially if like your life experience would have it that, you know, you've tried before and you've been rejected. Like, of course the brain is going to see it through that lens. Like, you can't just switch the lens all of a sudden. Like, you have to, it doesn't work like that. So, and that can be really helpful for clients, especially if they're like, I know that I should like be grateful and go to church and pray more about this. And that's where I have to step in and be like, okay, but your life experience would have it that you've been rejected before. And so can we just sit in the reality that you have been? And can we grieve that for you for a bit before we get all, you know, gung-ho about it?
It's like both things can be true. Like, your experience of loneliness and an opportunity for healing. Like, it doesn't have to be like, just need to get rid of this feeling of loneliness by doing all this stuff. It's like, okay, yeah, for sure. But we also need to acknowledge the ways that you have been wounded and your body and your mind are trying to protect you from it. Like, the whole self-centeredness piece too, I'm realized it's a protection mechanism. And it's interesting seeing how, I mean, my listeners know this, that like I'm a Christian and Katia is a Christian. It's like we believe in like the design of the body and like how magnificent it is, of like, oh my gosh, yeah, of course, like I don't want to be isolated because I would die. Like if we would die. Like, if we think about it from a like very straightforward viewpoint, you need people to eat, to sleep, you know, like there is an element of like, we are just biologically designed so that like pain receptor going off is like, no, like you need to be like moving into community, not just because it's like a spiritual good thing. It's like, no, it's actually like a survival thing as well.
And like thinking about it like, us as a human species, we are the best at working as a team.
Number one, baby.
Number one. And like better than any other species ever.
Suck it.
So it's like, if that's fundamentally wired in us, when that fundamental wiring feels off, it's going to be really painful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a part of kind of what we're talking about too is like, how are you showing up for yourself in that pain? Because a huge contributor, I think the official term is like confirmation bias, like where our brain is looking for, you know, like that evidence. Like I think you were mentioning it earlier of like, oh, see, that person looked at me weird, or that person canceled plans, or that, like, we're like looking for ways to kind of confirm the self-preservation that's happening inside of us. And that like makes sense on paper. It's just very maladaptive in a lot of ways. It's like, just because you're experiencing these painful things does not mean you have to stop showing up for yourself in your pain and doom scrolling and distracting yourself, and the avoiding affect, which is something I've been learning a lot about, the affect avoidance model, which my boss has been teaching me a lot about, where we create these patterns in our lives to avoid painful feelings. That's like where most diagnoses basically come from. It's just avoiding pain. And so it makes sense why people would want to avoid the loneliness. It's just unfortunate that a lot of our strategies lead to more loneliness.
Yeah. It's a catch-22.
Yeah. Did you find anything else interesting in your research about loneliness that you feel like was super impactful for your own struggle?
So some other interesting research that I stumbled upon was like the connection between the human tongue's taste receptors and how our bitter taste receptors are 10,000 times more sensitive than the sweet taste receptors. And that's because it's functionally adaptive. And like people born without pain receptors lead very dangerous lives because they don't know that they're hurting themselves. And loneliness, when thought in that lens, it's just a much more gentle way of going about it.
Yeah, because it's like, I think that's why I wanted to talk about loneliness and even dive into some of the mechanisms. I'm like, I'm not pretending that either one of us are neuroscientists research about loneliness, but the curiosity about the mechanisms I think are worth exploring and talking about, because then we will live less dangerous lives, so to speak, because we're aware of what's going on, which can fuel some compassion inside of us and for other people. Like the more that I'm on this journey of self-compassion along with my clients, along with you and like other people in my life, it's like, okay, like these things that I am learning, I want them to fuel a new approach to myself, especially when I'm avoiding very painful things, because I mean, as therapists, we're always going to take you back to childhood somehow.
That's right.
You can't get away with that with this episode, with any episode moving forward, guys, without me bringing up your childhood. You know, I think we learn this stuff really young.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking kindergarten, preschool, like we learn how to perceive ourselves and others very quickly.
Yeah.
As a way of survival, like we've been talking about, but it also can just get so jacked up because people like my mom used to say this all the time growing up, like kids are mean. Like just straight up mean. And I think like my worldview like truly does believe that like bad behavior is not just like learned, like it's in our bones.
Yeah.
And so I think we are probably nursing wounds we're not even fully aware of from our younger selves. That's why it's so important to do your inner child work and to do your like child timelines or whatever your therapist is making you do. And if you're not seeing a therapist, highly encourage it.
Highly encourage. Would promote.
Yeah, because you're worth exploring. Like your story is worth discovering, not just for funsies. It's actually for like life changing. Yeah, for survival, like for life changing like purposes. And like for you, I'm so curious what it was like reading all of this research and like how did it impact you and like your perception of like how do I treat my own loneliness and like myself?
Yeah, I think sort of what we were just talking about, like viewing it as like a pain receptor almost was really helpful for me, because at times like when I have felt lonely, I have viewed it as like a fundamental moral character flaw.
Yeah, can you say more about that? Because you mentioned morality earlier and I was like, ooh, that feels like it struck a chord with some people.
Yeah, well, I think growing up like in the church, and I think that there were really good intentions, but there's a huge push like towards more extroversion, towards more service-oriented ways of serving in the church, which is great, but not everyone is wired for that. And so I think that growing up, especially when I was much more socially inhibited in some ways, I think I felt a lot of shame around the fact that like I wasn't like the kid that was, you know, like welcoming everybody at the doors of the youth group and like throwing myself out there and like serving on student government and all of that sort of thing. And I grew up in a small private Christian school, and which was great most of the time. But it was also damaging at times because I just wasn't wired to relate to people in a lot of those ways. And so I think that especially introversion has been kind of like almost demonized in a way.
She said it here, folks.
Yeah, of like, well, it's just like seen as subpar or below when, and I think that a lot of times when it comes to loneliness, people just assume that people who are introverts are lonely because they're not out there partying it up, when really, like we're saying, it's not the quantity of the friends that you have, it's the quality of the friends that you have. So I think that that sort of that research was like, aw, little Katia would have loved to hear that. So,
oh my gosh, yeah.
yeah.
And it makes me think too, like addressing the issue of like people's social needs are different.
Yeah.
And when we try to put people in a box into a system under the guise of religiosity or spirituality or whatever it is for people, it can be really a shameful experience, for lack of a better term, I would say, of like, what is wrong with me? I feel lonely because of my, like, who I am and my personality. Like, I am more extroverted, right? And I think I did equate as well. Like, if I show up in a certain way, it's going to come across like in like a youth group setting or in a social setting, and I am the center of attention or speaking the most or whatever, I'm going to like be seen as more godly or more closer. Or like I'm going to have, I'm living in community the way that God wanted us to. And like, there is sort of this, I think just, I'm trying to speak from the other side of it, like more the extroverted side. Like I do think there was a structure kind of preached from the pulpit in that way. Or maybe even not preached, just expected of like, yeah, like we're called to fellowship and community. So what does that look like for I'm just thinking of the introvert listening who does struggle with friends and with people. It's not like you don't want friends. It's just, it looks different for you and that need is different for you.
Like specifically like in a church context?
In any context.
Yeah. I think maybe creating spaces where people don't necessarily have to have like 24/7 face-to-face communication, or like more small group sort of activities, or just different avenues of going about connection that's not quite as intense. I think so. Yeah, that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, it's almost like the question I want to ponder walking away from this part of the episode is like, what can I do to help change some of that culture a little bit that we've built in the church? I'm just like bringing it back to the church of just like, or even maybe more in a secular context too. It's like the people that are extroverted, like, oh, they enjoy life more fully, or they are like part of the popular cool crowd, you know, like there are also other like labels and systems like put in place for sure. And it's like, how do we learn to just be okay with our social needs? And like, I'm okay with my 2-3 friends, or I'm okay. And like how do we get to know ourselves so we can meet our own social need? Because it's going to be different.
And something my boss actually said at a staff or at a CEU recently that I was like, oh, he was saying, you know, like sometimes the center of the room is the safest place to hide. And I was like,
oh, snap.
Oh. And so it's like when you see those people that are like the center of attention and very maybe loud and gregarious, like their internal experience may not actually be all that loud and gregarious. It may be very isolating. So just because somebody presents as like, oh, I have all these friends and I'm so connected, like they deserve just as much attention.
Yeah.
So
that's a really good point, Katia. Because I feel like I resonate more with that person. Like I'm not too much of a wallflower, but it also does feel safer to be like, let me tell you a joke. But inside you're like, you know what I mean? It's like there is like the unhealthy side of everyone's like proclivities or personalities. It's like if I'm drawn to extroversion, there are safe maladaptive places that I have found. And I'm sure with introverts as well. It's like
there's safe maladaptive places to hide too.
So I kind of want to pivot, into like what role does I mean, we've touched on this a little bit, but like what role does therapy play in this? And what are you learning in that realm is like, how can therapy help, and how do you feel like it's helped you? How is it helping your clients?
Yeah. I think that therapy can provide a safe space for people to sort of relaunch once they've been disconnected for too long. And it can serve sort of as like a safe, like an emotionally protected place where people can sort of like report back to or, sort of process hard interactions or celebrate good interactions with somebody that's going to challenge them, hopefully to continue down a path of healing, but also validate the reality of that person's emotional experience just as it comes, like not trying to change it, not trying to dictate it, just taking it as it comes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you were the one that told me this, or maybe it was another classmate, about your boss or your supervisor talking about everyone needs to experience validation, installation of hope. And there was like something else I can't remember. But kind of along the lines of what you're saying, it's like there is an environment and a space that we create in our profession. I love how you said it is a launching pad, like is something that is not meant to be, we're not meant to be your best friend. Sorry, guys.
Sorry.
But it is a model for what it is that you should be looking for and what it is you should be becoming for other people. There's a good duality to that as well, of like, what do I want to receive and give in my journey of healing this loneliness?
Yeah.
And I think that what's hard is the motivation to want to heal your loneliness is where I get really stuck with my own self. And maybe it's like you're too far deep in that spiral we were talking about earlier with like the negativity bias and like chronic loneliness. So what does it look like to find that motivation to actually not be lonely anymore, right? Like sometimes there is like a comfortability in like our avoidance. Like it's safer to just sit and scroll and look at people's lives and feel protected than like step into that risk.
Yeah. I think it like once it becomes familiar, it's really hard to break out of.
Come
on now. And I think it can be hard for a lot of different reasons. But I think the motivation, I think, is going to differ person to person. So I guess I can really only speak for myself. But in seasons of life where I have like found familiarity in a season of loneliness, and I have like I didn't want to put myself out there. I didn't want to be vulnerable with people. Like that's the biggest thing for me. It was like I don't want to be vulnerable with you.
And you.
Right. So I think that the motivation truly was that I was just sick and tired.
I was sick and tired.
I was like, I can't do this anymore, because like we're wired for connection, and the longer it sat, I just like became more unbearable. And so I was like, okay, like something has to change, something has to move, and it has to be me, unfortunately.
And that's hard. I feel like the messaging as we're doom scrolling is cut this person off. This person is toxic. Like sometimes I'm worried that even some of the strategies we use for our own like comfortability and our own loneliness, what can impact that motivation is like what voices we're giving power into our lives. And whether it's our own voice or other people's voices, it's like, how do we find those people that are going to like be like, hey, I haven't seen you in a while. Like, how you doing? Like checking in on you, you know, like who are those people that are going to keep you in check a little bit beyond your therapist that you see for 1 hour a week, you know, like what does that look like? I'm always assessing for like support systems outside of that. Like you cannot find, I mean, yes, there is internal motivation we need to work on, but if you don't have like other people like looking out for you, it's going to be a lot harder. So sometimes it's like, we need to make sure, I love that we keep bringing it back to the point that this is a necessity. It's not just an option, like eating and sleeping, right? I don't really feel like drinking water today. It's like, well, you're probably going to get a headache because you're going to be dehydrated. And so we need to start treating loneliness like all of the other receptors in our brain, just as valuable, right? I think the first thing to go out the window is spending time with friends, checking in on friends. Family also plays a role in this as well. Finding those like support groups or like places of fun and levity with people, like that's a journey. That's
a protective factor.
Yes, come on now. And that's like been one of the biggest things for me too, is like, where do I find play with people? Where do I find fun with people? Like I love connecting over a cup of coffee, chatting about the deep parts of life and putting microphones in front of our face to do it. But I also just want to like dance and have fun and be like, you know, goofy and not do that by myself. You know, like there is like a place to like assess, okay, what do I need right now? And what do I feel like other people need? But for you, like, how do you find that balance of like, we kind of addressed this earlier, of like there is like a self-centeredness piece that plays a role in loneliness. So it's like, how do you, as you're in this journey of coming out of like loneliness, into building relationships, it's like, how do you find that balance of like, these are my needs and I feel lonely and hurt, but I'm also aware that other people that I'm like making friends with or have been friends with are also carrying their own baggage of loneliness.
Yeah. I would not say that I've perfected that balance by any means.
What's the formula, Katia?
I think something that's been helpful has kind of been like, hey, this area of life or whatever has been difficult for me. But then giving that person also the space to share with me like what's been going on for them. Basically it just comes back down to like reciprocity. Because I think sometimes when people have gone for so long without being heard because they've been so lonely for so long, it's like sometimes they'll come at you and it's just like they won't stop talking because finally someone's here to listen, which I think is like necessary sometimes, but it can be a lot for the other person. And so I think that I've made it a point like, okay, like I don't want to put that on somebody else when they don't have the capacity for it. Yeah. Like there's a difference between like when someone has the capacity for that versus when they don't. And so it's kind of like sort of, you got to sniff it out first.
It is tough. I mean, we're really talking about the gray area here, which is like our favorite phrase of it depends. And we kind of joked about making t-shirts that said it depends.
I still think we should.
Because that was always the answer, like a clinical question we would ask or whatever. Yeah. It's always, it depends. And I think a lot of what we talk about too is like, yeah, it kind of really depends on like your situation and other people's situation. So as you're like listening to us, keep assessing like your own, you know, situation. And like one strategy that I've been trying is like anytime my like social pain receptors going off, I kind of use that as a signal to like reach out to other people of like, how are you? Like, what's going on? Like, how are you doing? Because it kind of reminds me like, yeah, other people probably have those same receptors going off too. And that's been like helpful because it does breed connection, right? Like I love hearing about people's lives and people like people that I really trust also like care about hearing about my life. And so you kind of use those as a way to, and that's what's been helpful for me. I don't know if that's like a solution for everybody. Like Katia said, it's not like a formula or anything, but I think just finding something of like, how do I reframe the way that I'm seeing this? Because the way I'm currently seeing it is not helpful, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
No, it does.
The other piece I was going to mention is I was listening to this TED Talk. I forget her name. It was like Baya Vose, I think is how you say her last name. But she was talking about these anchors of connection was like her big like crescendo like in the talk. And I was curious about your thoughts about it because she was saying like in the face of like your own disasters or in the face of like communal disasters that happen, like having rituals of connection with yourself and each other are very grounding things. And I just loved that concept. Like for her, it kind of sounds cheesy, so stay with me. But like for her, it was like, me and my friends every Monday, we get in our fun leggings and we sit on the couch and talk. And like the way she said it was kind of cheesy, but the concept I really admired was like, okay, yeah, like what habits and rituals am I building into my life in the people that I care about and the people. So like, because it's sometimes I'd be like, I feel lonely. Well, let me just go hang out with somebody and I won't feel lonely anymore. It's like, I'm talking like long-term healing of these symptoms. I think there needs to be some like rituals, for lack of a better term, or anchors put in place to like help people. Like, do you, like, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Something that you said about this person who was doing the TED Talk sort of brought this up is like, I think like as a society and especially our generation, like we're all about the celebrations. We're all about like the get-togethers and the parties. But then when someone's having a hard time, or like when we're having a hard time, we don't mourn with anybody else. Yeah. We isolate ourselves. And so it's like, it's such, and you think about other cultures in the world that do a better job of mourning and grieving than we do. And like, we should take a look at that, honestly, because the, like just Western culture just doesn't grieve well, doesn't mourn well, doesn't sit well with pain, just in general. And so I think that it can be sort of a a shift for us when we're having a hard time to just invite other people in.
Yeah.
And there's always risk that that person may not have the capacity, but if we never take that risk, no one ever will.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes me think of just like the whole societal piece to all of this too. Like, why is it so prevalent? Going back to that question we asked, like, I know it's not just social media. Like, there is, like, if this life is supposed to all be about happiness and peace and love and all the good things that we want, right? Like that inner longing of just like, we just want things to be good. Of course, we're not going to want to sit in like the hard with people. Like, it can kind of feel like a waste of time. Like, why would I do that? And it's like, for me and like my worldview and like what I think like we both believe is like, it makes sense why it would be hard to sit in that, right? Because things aren't as they should be.
Yeah.
And like the whole pain aversion thing, I think I've had a lot more compassion for people that have that now, because I'm like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Like, if your goal in life is happiness, you're not like that doesn't fit in with what you want and what you need. And it's like, no, like I read something so like impactful this week in the Psalms that was like, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And it said suffering has no permanent place in God's creation. And there was something about that like message that really struck me of like, yeah, like suffering doesn't mean we avoid it. Doesn't mean we spiritually bypass it.
Nope.
And it doesn't mean, like we secularly bypass it, whatever the other term is for that, like however other people bypass pain. It's like we can engage with it fully, knowing that it's not the end. Yeah. And I found such like hope in that made me feel like I'm more willing to like sit in my own pain 100%. And sit with other people's pain.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah. I had someone years ago say that, like personally for me, like what I believe is that suffering that pushes me towards Jesus is suffering that isn't wasted. And so like that is not said in the sense of like, oh, let's spiritually bypass it and just say like, oh, well, like everything's great, never mind. Because there's been times where things have not been great. But yeah, suffering has no permanent place.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts around like building the courage to invite people to mourn with you and grieve with you? Because I'm just thinking from my own perspective, like that does kind of feel like
it's scary,
foreign. Yeah,
it's
like
scary.
Like okay, I'm feeling like, because I've had a lot of friends be like, I don't want to be a downer. So like, because when I find out they're struggling, like, why didn't you tell me? It's like, oh, I'm not really fun to be around right now.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do we start setting that expectation within our own circles?
Yeah.
Like, I don't care. Like, I want to like hang out with you, even if you're depressed, even if you just lost someone, even if you like how do you like manage that piece?
Yeah. I actually had a conversation with a friend about this sort of like not that long ago, where she was kind of apologizing for suffering and struggling. And I said, I'd much rather like just hear about your experience honestly than like to just be like, oh, we're fine, because then I would feel safe to do the same with you.
Yeah. And
I think that's kind of what it comes down to. Is like, I would much rather hear people's honest experience than pretend like everything is fine, because then I'll never feel like I can do the same with them.
Yeah. And I've heard this before, again, like just speaking about like church culture and stuff. It's like they say that like we want people to say like, if you're not doing good, like talk about it. And sometimes I'd be hesitant because I'm like, I don't really trust the person, like or the person I see once a week to be like, how are you doing? Well, actually, I'm not doing like, because I don't know how it's going to be received.
Yeah.
And so how do you build some of that resilience when you're going to get a bad response? Like, it's inevitable. You're going to get people that don't know what to say, or it's uncomfortable, right? Like if you're trying to be this change in the world, it's not always going to be, you're going to have to overcome some hurdles and stuff. And I think I get kind of stuck at that point too, of like, okay, like I want to be honest with people, and different levels of honesty for sure, like layers of intimacy for sure. But I don't know, like I think I really get stumped up, and that kind of contributes to my loneliness a little bit of like, oh, if I like go to church, or if I go to this thing, it's like, like then I have to like explain why I feel sad, or I don't even know why I feel sad right now, or so it's just easier to just hide in the center and make some jokes and be the extrovert and all these things. And I feel like I'm being really vulnerable right now actually in saying that, but it's just like, yeah, like how do you build that resilience in some of the maybe not as helpful responses you might get.
Yeah. That's a hard question, Brenna.
I'm asking some hard hitters today. I feel like
hard question. Yeah. No, that's a really hard one. I think it's oof. Yeah. That one gets me too. I think that like there's a difference between like if you're received poorly, like then like you have two options. You can sort of like turn on yourself internally and be like, see, you shouldn't have done that. You should have known better. And like that's sort of our first go-to. And I know that's been my first go-to when I haven't been received well. I'm like, you should have seen this coming. But really I think what that like whole social like interaction was that the person that you were trying to connect with like is probably dealing with their own pain and they're just not at a place where they can receive you, and like that's a hard reality too. Like there's no good answer.
Yeah And I think part of the reason some of these questions feel so like hard hitting is like I think because we're just like in the thick of it right now. Like again, neither of us are experts in any of this stuff, but we do like feel these things very deeply and are sorting through them in our 20s. And I think I'm curious about this sort of last piece that I like to end like podcast with is like I want to leave our audience with a question to think about in this topic of loneliness, and I'm curious for you, like what would that question be?
I think there's so many questions that could be left with this audience. I think probably the question that I like immediately thought of is like what are some areas of our own lives, like what is our loneliness pointing towards? Because it's always pointing towards something. So for those of us who are experiencing loneliness or just like a lonely season or chronic loneliness or loneliness that has lasted for years, like what is that pointing towards? And if like we're not 100% sure right now, that's okay. But I think that again, therapy can be a really good space to sort of parcel that one out. Because everything that's maladaptive points towards something. And like there's a reason for every dysfunction. It serves something, even though it's not healthy. So I think, that would be my question. Like, what is your loneliness pointing towards?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, guys. I hope that that's helpful for you to kind of ponder and walk away with in this conversation. Katia, thank you so much for taking time and doing the research and sharing the things that you found. And I just think it's such a connecting piece to even just be able to honestly talk about it with you and talk about it, virtually with other people that are listening. And I just hope that this is something that everyone who's on this journey of life finds a little bit of connection through this podcast. But thank you guys so much for listening.
The content provided on Soul Things Podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always seek the advice for your physician, mental health provider, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding medical conditions or mental health concerns.